Hi and welcome to episode 41 of The Party Line. This podcast was recorded on Aboriginal land and we stand in solidarity with our Indigenous brothers and sisters in their struggle against racism and capitalism.
Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling party line. Oh, I never will forsake thee, for I love this life of mine.
Hi Oskar.
Hi Anneke.
Where are we?
We're in the lovely Footscray VS Victorian Socialist West office. It's a bit bare at the moment, but
that's right.
I quite like it.
We had to do a bit to kind of get the ambience sort of ready. It's just you and me here today.
It is, yes.
Jordan, Omar, look, I've tried to convince them about the West.
Look, you know, if some people are just steadfast in their ways in the northern suburbs, like, you just got to leave them behind. And look, I've had a successful coup against them, and maybe I'll take over from their roles,
well,
maybe.
I think if we can continue to do the podcast in the West, I'll be for you taking over the co-host position. So, but yeah, it's good to be here with you. You're sipping lemsip. You're a bit sick.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a cold, but, you know. Doesn't stop me from getting onto the Party Line podcast, so, you know.
That's right, yeah, you got time for us, that's good. So, yeah, we wanted to have a bit of a special episode today because there's two pretty important events coming up and they happen to fall on the same day. So we wanted to talk a bit about the Pilbara strike, which took place on May Day. And how many years has it been? Is it the 60th anniversary?
It's the 80th anniversary of the Pilbara strike, which is quite incredible given it's one of the longest industrial actions in Australia's labour history. So it's something worthy to celebrate, but also talk about in terms of the traditions and what we can learn about it from today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we get into the Pilbara strike, we've actually got a bit of sort of news or headlines kind of specific to the question of racism and Indigenous oppression in Australia. So do you want to tell us about one of them?
Yeah, so I think we've found two recent examples of just like intense anti-Aboriginal racism just playing out, of course, on a day-to-day basis in this country. The one I've found recently was that there's been a lot of flooding in the Northern Territory, and a lot of remote Indigenous communities have actually just been housed in these compound towns by the Northern Territory government because their houses have been flooded, their communities have been flooded. But in these compound towns, they've just been treated like prisoners, basically, where government officials have been walking in, putting their torchlights on saying, "Are you sleeping?" Lots of women and children who go out to buy goods and foods and stuff have been checked, by these welfare cops saying, "What have you bought?" basically. So it's like, is there any contraband or so forth? So it's like, even when these mob up in Northern Territory who have got their houses and communities flooded are in these evacuated towns and settlements, still get treated like dirt shit, basically, by the government. And even things like legal services and health services in the local town have not been allowed to be let into these compound prisons, basically, which is quite like, you know, not only stripping off your ability to move around, but stripping your ability to go out and get services to actually help you out, basically. So
these are
horrific.
people who have been in a flood zone, have been evacuated, and then they've been put in prison-like circumstances.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's just no one would allow or accept that behaviour if it was, flood victims from, Lismore or something like that. It's the fact that it's Indigenous people means that they get treated like dirt.
Exactly, and I think it's just so horrific. And like a lot of people, when they're going to return to their communities and housing, which have been flooded, it's all going to be so damaged and just horrifically in a terrible position. And whether or not the Northern Territory government will go out to assist these people once they return back to these communities, probably least likely, given it's probably one of the most racist governments and racist iterations in the Northern Territory. So it's a really significantly awful situation. Some of the Aboriginal people up there in the Northern Territory have felt like, even though I'm returning to my house which has been flooded, this has been sort of better than the prison camps I've been put into, which tells you a lot about that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the other story that I found was about Indigenous woman, a Noongar woman, Marianne Miller, who was evicted from her public housing, was a victim of domestic violence and abuse, had recently given birth and was forced into homelessness and died of a sepsis infection. And like just every level of the story is just like this woman was totally abandoned by the systems and services that are supposed to be in place for people, which points to the lack of adequate public housing. It points to the lack of adequate healthcare. It points to the lack of enough refuges for women and their children escaping domestic violence situations. And I think it points to one of the things about the sort of experience of racism in Australia today, which is that a big aspect of it is the poverty and lack of services that exist for people. You're pushed to the margins and edges of society, and this has lethal consequences, and particularly for Indigenous people.
Yeah, I mean, death. Like, you know, lots of Indigenous people die as a result of these horrific conditions. Like, a lot of Indigenous people end up homeless because of being pushed out of public housing. Even for Aboriginal people who are in public housing, a large proportion of them are renters. And, you know, with the compounding effects of just intense poverty, low wages, low welfare benefits and so forth, it means you're in a constant state of perpetual oppression. That means you could be evicted, even if you're not, you're still copying the worst of, you know, the oppression that is manifested in this country that affects all working class people as well. So this story, it just, you know, rips your heart out basically. But I think it's one, you know, for this woman who passed away in really awful circumstances is another name adding on to the amount of deaths and oppression that Aboriginal people face on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, 21st century Australia, so-called progressive country, you know, these stories I think tells you otherwise basically.
And I think as well it shows the way that people with multiple forms of oppression, you know, an Indigenous woman, a poor woman, a woman, the way that, you know, your life experience can just be totally ruined when there's not support systems in place. So I think that like no one should be made homeless when they're trying to escape an abusive partner. And you know, we've been talking a lot on the pod about the fact that the government has put an extra $53 billion towards defence spending. There's the $368 billion on the AUKUS nuclear submarines. The government pays their, you know, top ministers, you know, huge salaries. I got someone to do a calculation for me because I'm not that good at maths. About like the PM, the cabinet, and the premiers around the country are paid over $12 million. So it's like if we just cut the salaries of, you know, all of the politicians and put it into things like adequate public housing, not just adequate, but like nice public housing people could live in, then we wouldn't have people dying in the streets trying to escape an abusive partner.
It's that simple, isn't it? You just put bucket loads of money. We're one of the wealthiest countries in this world, basically, and we could use all that money that we have, whether it's from the fossil fuel industry to the politicians to wherever, and put it into housing, towards health, towards these many areas that will actually drastically lift up Aboriginal people, but also people in general, from poverty. But once we put that out, we're confronted by a system, right, that prioritises profits, that prioritises the dominance and the rule of our politicians and the capitalist class. And so we're up against a lot, but I think looking towards those areas of just like, we could actually do this if we were to run society in a much more democratic, collective fashion, these things could actually happen. So I think the fight is still on all these areas, of course. So
riding out the party line.
Well, Oskar, you've been doing a bit of research into the Pilbara strike. This was the longest running strike in Australian history. I believe it is still the longest running strike in Australian history. It was started on May Day, and I think is one of these really incredible moments of solidarity between oppressed people in this country and the working class, and sort of points a bit of a guiding line towards what it would take to actually fight against oppression in this country, which is solidarity, struggle and resistance. So I think it's a pretty important thing for us to be talking about on May Day.
Absolutely. And I think it is great that we're doing this episode as a sort of May Day special episode, because I feel like we're in a situation today where war, barbarism, huge inequality is just driving up even more. We need to revive a bit of traditional radical working class action against these sort of conditions, and looking towards these episodes of workers, both Aboriginal and white and whoever, actually fighting against their bosses. Reviving that sort of tradition is really necessary for today's time for not only blackfellas, but as I said, anyone in this country. And before we launch into the Pilbara strike, I wanted to share some badges.
I got some show and tell.
Yeah, because I thought, it's May Day, and I'm a bit of an avid badge collector in terms of different struggles.
I didn't know that about you.
Yeah, well, you get to know me a bit more on this podcast for the whole world. But I thought I'd bring these badges in because a few of them... most of them are talking a bit about like strikes and trade unions and sort of the radical tradition that we're trying to tap into. The first one, which I'll show you the viewers, is the Barrier Industrial Council from 1984.
Beautiful.
This is the trade union from Broken Hill, which in the 1970s doco was called the kind of like Soviet satellite state because, okay, FYI, it wasn't. But the reason why it was called that is because there was this really intense, radical tradition of workers just like running the show, basically. If you fuck with workers in Broken Hill, they'll come back 10 times harder and screw the bosses, basically, which created this tradition of the Barrier Industrial Council being a really radical trade union. So that's really cool. And it's a small badge, so
do you know what the numbers are? 2816? So that's someone like union number or something?
I think so, yeah. There's a lot. If you go to the Trades Hall building in Broken Hill, there's a huge swath of badges just like this, so dating back to, I think, even the 1930s.
You didn't steal it, did you?
Nah. No, I did not. Anyway, moving on. This one is called Victory to the MUA. It says, better to break the law than break a union.
Nice.
This is a badge from the old International Socialist Organisation, the ISO. This was, I think, around the time when Howard was trying to break up the MUA during a dispute back then. I think it was 98, I'm pretty sure. And so that was a real big time in terms of the government, a real right-wing government on the attack against really, a union that had a lot of radical traditions and power to destabilise the Australian economy. And this one was just basically talking about how, we need to push back against Howard and break the law if we need to defend the MUA. And the last one is, I was talking to you, Anneke, about whether or not where this is from. I think it's Malcolm Fraser. It says, stuff this turkey, defend our unions. And I think it looks, maybe we could do a bit of a polling. Is this Malcolm Fraser or not? I'm not too sure.
We should do a phone a friend called Jerem or something like that.
I think so too.
But I want to know what the historical context for him being I think that maybe it's just like lingo that is just not in use any longer.
Yeah, look, I was born in 2001, so I'm a bit of a young'un when it comes to these old references. So I got no idea. Maybe we have to just call Jerry and be like, what on earth is going on here? Why is Malcolm Fraser a turkey? But just something I thought I would show, and some of the things, the past stories are really radical and awesome, but something to learn from as well. So
I wore a shirt to commemorate this one as well. It says Dr. Scab, and it's got a vampire snake and a frog on it. It's from that podcast Working Class History. My brother-in-law got it for me. But it's there's a poem about the scab is the lowest creature on earth, the lowest form of, being on earth, lower than a rat, lower than a whatever. So it's commemorating that sort of poem.
It's funny that you mentioned scabs. When back in the heyday of Broken Hill in the 1910s and 1920s, if you were a scab, back in radical working class traditions, you would frown upon scabs in the workplace and so forth. Broken Hill took it to a next level. If you were a scab in Broken Hill, the workers and the trade unionists would go to your house, dig up a grave, put a tombstone and say that this is for so-and-so who's a scab in Broken Hill. And then the person will obviously open the door and go, oh, I better leave.
Yeah.
So, maybe bring that back today's time. I don't know, but we can debate that out.
Yeah, I mean, like, it sort of points to a militancy and a working class kind of consciousness that doesn't exist anymore. Like, how many people around our age have ever been able to go on strike to be able to use their industrial muscle? We don't have these long disputes that make victories and also show people their collective strength either. We don't have towns that are union towns where the union and the working class get to dictate conditions of labour, hiring and firing. So it kind of points to what we need to build up towards, which is like people feeling like they have collective power and the capacity to struggle and fight back. Because I think at the moment, like, let alone someone being a scab, like, who thinks that you can even fight and win? So points to the necessity of rebuilding union traditions in Australia.
Totally, and our identification of those lessons is going on the downfall, given like union membership has been as lowest in recent memories. As you said, the amount of strikes that are being put on, lowest in recent memories. So this identification of, I'm part of a class, that is the working class, and we have this power to fight back against the bosses. That being sort of lost over recent memories is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And something that we want to be able to intervene into unions and say, bring that back to that tradition, not just because of nostalgic reasons that these past stories are so wonderful as they are, but that, as I mentioned before, we've got a plethora of issues of capitalism tearing our lives apart, and we need that tradition to fight back against that situation. That's why we're going to talk about the Pilbara strike, which is a pretty excellent story.
All right, well, let's dig into it, because I think most people's understanding of the Pilbara is of a mining region, and there have been pretty important mining strikes and union activity around the mines in the Pilbara, but we're not dealing with the mining era, we're dealing with the pastoralist era. So can you tell us a bit about Pilbara, the condition on the pastoral estates, and also just the broader context of like racism in Western Australia, and what it was like for Indigenous people at this time?
Yeah. To give a bit of a sense of the pastoralists, like they were one of the sort of main capitalist classes in Australia. When colonisation happened here in Australia, they were one of the big sort of capitalist classes that were so intransigent on wanting to get rid of the Aboriginal population. They were involved in a lot of the massacres that happened in around the 19th century, and headed that sort of project alongside the Australian state when it was starting to build itself up. After that kind of period of colonisation was successful in this country, the Australian project is successful in trying to push Aboriginal people off their land. The pastoralists then sort of came in to develop their industry in areas like the Pilbara to basically grow their profits and so forth. And key to that was having Aboriginal labour as the backbone of this industry, which basically made it out to be slave labour. So Aboriginal workers in the pastoralist industry, most men, Aboriginal men, were not paid. Even if they were paid, it would be like a quarter of the amount of wages given to white male workers. Women in the industry were paid nothing. Yeah. So it's even like far worse for Aboriginal women as well, compared to Aboriginal men, even though Aboriginal men were barely paid anything at lots of times as well. So I think that is a really important part of understanding the pastoralist industry. And the pastoralists were very aware of this, of the fact that Aboriginal labour was key for them to become a profiteering industry, that the bosses of that industry were so rewarded of that profits. And so I wanted to read this quote out of a pastoralist and actually a future WA Premier, John Forrest.
Okay.
That points to this awareness of like, we know what we're doing and we just want to do it because we've got the fucking power. And he said, this is in the Northern Territory, our Northern Territory has been settled and developed largely through the instrumentality of the native population. And many of us, including myself, would not be in the position we are today if we had not been able to avail ourselves of native labour on our stations. So it's like, it's there.
It's pretty clear, this argument that actually Indigenous people, and the racist sort of parlance of the time, the native population, are required for this industry to exist. And so there's a economic incentive to keep people in this situation, but then also there's just a huge amount of ideological racism that exists towards Indigenous people at this time as well. Like, I think it's pretty safe to say that the politicians, the pastoralists, the ruling class in Australia understood Indigenous people as less than human and treated them as such. And I think pointing to as well the role of women on the estates is really important too, because they were paid nothing but required to do huge amounts of labour to keep the whole industry running. They cooked the food, they cleaned, they meant it, like their labour meant that the official labour could actually take place, and so. I mean, could you tell us a bit as well about like the sort of institutional systematic racism that existed in Western Australia too? Because it was the pastoral ruling class, but also the government that created a situation to keep Indigenous people in lower positions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would point to two things in regards to that. In terms of policies and state institutions that were so bullish about keeping Aboriginal people down, not only economically but also ideologically. And what I mean, and when we're referring to that, I think it's also just ripping off the sort of authority and self-determination of Aboriginal people to determine their own lives, be able to control what they do, how they relate to each other. And I think, so the two things that I want to refer to is the WA Aborigines Act of 1905 and the Department of Native Affairs, two sort of key policies and institutions that the Pilbara strike actually had to confront when they were striking against the pastoralists and WA government. The WA Aborigines Act basically enshrined that they could control and detain Aboriginal children in institutions and service work up to the age of 16. So it's this like real like pernicious controlling of communities right from the early age of Aboriginal children right up to 16 basically. So there's intense like, we control your life basically, and we do that as the government of WA basically. And that worked in combination with the Department of Native Affairs, where you had basically the head of the department being the legal guardian of all Aboriginal children, as stipulated by that act. It's like one person, the head department figure of this Native Affairs institution, basically being the so-called like father of all Aboriginal children. It's insane. It basically rips those children away from their families, away from their communities, and disempowers the whole entire Aboriginal population in that region and all across Western Australia, not just the Pilbara as well. Another thing in regards to the Department of Native Affairs though, which makes it even more sinister, is that they also control the payments given to Aboriginal children and parents under this thing called the Child Endowment, which was created by Robert Menzies at the time. Well, I think, it was created by Robert Menzies in the 1940s. He was the Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister, notable racist against Aboriginal people. They would control these payments given to Aboriginal families, but they wouldn't give money to the Aboriginal families directly. What they do is they'll make orders to local stores and then give those orders to Aboriginal families, such as things like food, other kinds of material and needs. And so it's like, not only are they controlling the money that is needed by Aboriginal family to lift themselves out of poverty, they're controlling the things that they need, which is like food. So it's really like so pernicious in the way in which they're trying to control. And
it means as well that people can't move between different parts of the country because they don't have money, like it's goods that they can access. It's in one spot. So it's controlling the movement of people too, which is obviously pretty limiting, especially if people had, like family in other parts of the country, being able to travel for cultural reasons would be difficult. And, like the thing about not actually being given money reminds me a lot of the cashless welfare card that was introduced more recently in our past, where instead of people being given money in their bank accounts if they were on government payments, they'd be given a card, which they can only use at certain shops. And this made life extremely horrible for Indigenous people because, and anyone, it was trialled first on Indigenous communities and then rolled out to others. But it means that you can't shop in the local store in your town. You have to travel into the city. It means that you can't spend money on your kid's school excursion because, so it's just, I think this whole history is one of dehumanisation and, a patronising attitude towards Indigenous people, let alone, things like violent police that murder people, pastoralists like Gina Reinhardt's father, who talked about wanting to poison the water wells to deal with the Indigenous question. Yeah,
absolutely. It's like, you have welfare cops on the beat ready to just like look at and surveil Aboriginal families and be like, what are you buying? What are you using your money for? Which is under that sort of cashless debit card, which Labor reintroduced under a new name, which is like, okay, change the name, change the face. It's still the same fucking thing, same thing that what the Liberals did, basically. Yeah. And in regards to the Pilbara, it got worse as when the onset of World War II happened as well, because the pastoralists were like so adamant that during World War II, our industry must be profitable. Our industry must stay up despite the war that's going on abroad, which sends millions of workers to their death, basically. This is an inter-imperialist war going on between major countries battling for, power and profits and so forth. And since the pastoralists were so adamant of keeping the industry up, they actually enforced Aboriginal people onto station camps to live there next to the cattle stations which they worked. And in these stations, there was lots of accounts of Aboriginal people, in particular women, saying that they slept on just like the ground, never got fed, barely got any water as well. And so it was like this real like intense slave labour of like, you're not only going to be fucked over at the workplace, but you're going to be chained to the workplace of where you're going to live. You're going to live right next to it, and we're not going to give you anything, because what matters to us is our industry stays up.
Yeah. Well, can you tell us a little bit about the strike itself? How did it come to be? Because the story of that is pretty incredible from what I've read.
It's amazing. Like, there was lots of discussions in the prelude to the strike in 1946. That's where it started on May 1st. There had been a lot of meetings in 1942 to 1944 of Aboriginal workers actually just coming together and sort of just discussing what can we actually do. Maybe this strike could be a weapon we can use. And that was a discussion by some of the more militant Aboriginal workers who were trying to understand what could this look like. A lot of the Aboriginal workers were still a bit underconfident in the sense of, geez, if we go up against the pastoralists and the WA government, this is a big thing. And it's like, fair enough. You want to have the confidence to be able to go up against intense racism and against these institutions who have the power, basically, to determine your life. So it's a big undertaking, but there have been lots of discussions about this. And what was key as well was having people, and we'll talk a bit more about that, like Clancy McKenna, Dooley Bin Bin, who are incredible lawmen of the Pilbara region and led the strike, and to convince people of the need to go on to this event. Yeah. But having people like Don McLeod, who was a member of the Communist Party, who was well respected and gained the trust of a lot of Aboriginal workers, he gave inspiration and confidence as well to a lot of these strikers to be like, you can actually do this. Let's work out this together. And so for about 2 years, I think around before and a little bit into the strike, people like Clancy McKenna and Dooley Bin Bin walked to all different stations in the Pilbara. Now, the Pilbara is a big fucking region, so it's we have a step counter today. I'm sure they'll probably smash that every day. They would walk to the stations and chat for 2 hours, could you not, or even more, convincing workers that you got to do this. I know that it's scary because you're up against so much, but we can do it because if we withdraw our labour, we're screwing over the bosses. This is what we can do. And after all these kinds of discussions, on May 1st, 800 cattle station workers across the Pilbara walked off their job. and it's amazing that it happened on May 1st, which is the commemorative celebration of workers across the world fighting against the bosses. So there's a lot of real discussions and debates that are going on, which I think is really interesting to know.
And in accounts that I've read of the Pilbara strike, so you mentioned some of the sort of leaders of the strike, but there's a gathering of, 200 Indigenous lawmen, leaders in their communities, who come together to discuss the need to go out and fight. And then people are given a calendar that they have to mark off in order to mean that they can all go on strike on the same day. So it's someone's job on the cattle station. Every night you mark off the calendar, and you have to mark off the calendar so that you can all go out together. And I think it's so such a wonderful way of coordinating people. We think we can just look at, it's 30th of April, all good. I know when I need to be, I've got a flight to Tasmania tomorrow, all good. But, it's just this way of keeping people connected. But then also the kind of trust that you have to have in other people too. You can't text them and be like, hey man, so you guys are going on strike today, yeah? It's nah, someone's been marking off the calendar. I know that people are going to walk out together. So I think that's pretty lovely. Can you tell us a bit about what the demands of the strike were?
So some of the demands reference where is it? Yeah. So 30 shillings per week as a basic minimum wage. So actually just dragging Aboriginal people out of poverty, that they should be paid the work that they're doing, radical idea. But, just to actually get that base minimum wage, the right to elect their own representatives in their communities, so when they're sort of deliberating with state governments and trade unions and so forth, so actually giving leadership and authority in these communities, and also the freedom of movement, which references, I think, the stuff that we're talking a bit about before, like the station camps that the pastoralists made Aboriginal people live on, the different sort of state institutions that controlled and restricted the movement of Aboriginal people, actually fighting to say, no, you do not control the way in which we move and cooperate with our different communities. We decide that.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about the connection between the sort of broader working class movement in Australia and the Pilbara strike? You've mentioned Don McLeod, who was a member of the CPA, the Communist Party of Australia. The CPA's involvement is not particularly unique, I suppose, in terms of some of the history of Indigenous resistance in Australia. The CPA, we have a lot of criticisms of the political perspective of the Communist Party of Australia in the sort of way that they were a Stalinist political organisation. They thought Stalin's Russia was communist. They also had some, unique ways of understanding where Indigenous oppression came from in Australia that was sort of, inherited from the sort of Communist International, which was the sort of Stalinist outfit that coordinated the different communist parties around the world. So they sort of thought that the Indigenous population in Australia, needed their own internal state in Australia. So there's all these theoretical positions which kind of matter in some regard. But then for a lot of people who were members of the Communist Party in Australia, the question was a little bit less, what's the theoretical guideline coming from, Moscow, and more, who are our enemies and who are our comrades, and what's the fight that we need to have. And so the Communist Party had been quite involved in struggles against Indigenous oppression around this period. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, the history of the Communist Party of Australia up until that point, and I would include the 20s and 30s because they were starting to, establish themselves as a force outside the Labor Party. They had a decently sort of positive history, I'd say, in regards to Aboriginal rights. They had written programs such as the Draft Program in the 30s that advocated for full self-determination, liberation for Aboriginal people, but connected that with working class struggle. So things like that are very positive in the sense of you've got not only an Australian state that is so entrenched in its oppression of Aboriginal people and working class people generally, but political forces like Labor who pretend to have this pretension to say, we're for the trade unions, we're for the workers, but then ultimately still help to run Australian capitalism. So to have the CPA as a force outside of that, actually advocating for Aboriginal rights, self-determination, that is positive on one level. But yeah, the sort of comments you make about the sort of what kind of force they were to became to be, a Stalinist force, that is important to note. And it actually did have an effect on the strike itself. I did mention Don McLeod, and overall had a real positive impact on the strikers themselves in terms of giving them the confidence, giving them good leadership and saying that you should go on strike. However, Don McLeod's no kind of like rank and file, kind of like, he's member number 1,000, whatever, blah, 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 blah. He's in some random suburb and maybe we'll reach out to him. He was a keen, very big advocate of Communist Party politics. He used to go to a lot of the Communist Party schools and not only to talk about Aboriginal politics, but politics of the Popular Front, the Third Period, like lots of, ingratiating himself in the Communist Party's agenda. And the reason why I raise that all is because when the strike was being talked about in 42 and around World War II, he actually made the argument that, we should not strike at the moment now is because we need to support the progressive war. Because at that time, the communist parties all across the world and the Comintern and the sort of Russian foreign policy argued to communist parties all across the world that we need to support World War II because it's a progressive war against fascism, which I think just mischaracterizes what the war's about. It's an inter-imperialist rivalry against all these major forces fighting against each other for power and dominance across the world. And what this war is doing is sending workers to their deaths on the battlefield for their supposed ruling class. And I think that was the wrong argument to make at that time, because you imagine if the strike started during World War II, how much of a debilitating factor that would have had to this awful war, not only from the fascists, but for all these other sort of capitalist warmongers about how, sending workers to death is actually bad. So that was problematic, I felt, in the sense of what could have actually happened with the strike and how much of a bigger impact it could have had during that time. So, that kind of politics of the Communist Party and Don McLeod's influence did, had a good positive impact, but there's qualifiers we need to note of, I think.
Absolutely. So the strike got support not just from the Communist Party, but also other sections of the working class. So could you tell us a bit about that, like the relationship between the Pilbara strikers and workers in other parts of the country?
Yeah, it became quite widespread for a lot of trade union councils and so forth. And the Communist Party did help in that regard by publishing like 20,000 paid newspapers, distributing across the country saying this strike needs your support basically. Like, it is amazing. It's Aboriginal workers who are the most impoverished and exploited part of the working class. We as workers need to show up and show our solidarity with these people. And it was incredible. Basically, 19 unions in Western Australia showed their support, not only in a political sense, but economically with the strike funds as well. 7 national unions of 4 trades and labour councils also supported the strike as well. So that's right across the country, not just only in Western Australia. And so it became this kind of real national phenomenon, basically, of the Pilbara workers are fighting against the pastoralists. We know who the pastoralists are, and we're on the side of the workers, basically. And key to this was not only the workers across other sort of areas of Australia were just supporting it, the strike, and that was the end of it. That support and solidarity was actually crucial for the strike to win, which I think is a really important argument to make. And so what I mean by this is, so the strike started in May 1946. It ended around 1949 in August. And the reason why it ended in success, mind you, which is really fantastic, is because the Communist Alliance Seamen's Union did a black ban on the shipment of wool from the Pilbara, which basically signalled sirens for the pastoralists and the Western Australian government going, oh shit, this is not good. And basically with this black ban, it meant that the government caved in and said, okay, we will give you your wages, we'll give you conditions if you can lift this black ban. And that's how the Pilbara strike ended in victory, which is beautiful, amazing story.
I think it sort of displays a few things. One, the way that under capitalism, the work that we do seems very, isolated and individual. It's like, you go to your workplace and you do your thing and then that's the end of it. But actually, labour, the production of goods and commodities is a massively collaborative process. The wool has to be sheared, it has to be processed, it has to be shipped, it has to be manufactured. And this is a productive process that spans not just across the continent of Australia, but across the entire globe. And so the actions of workers in one spot can have profound impacts on the actions of workers elsewhere. This is not a phenomenon that was unique to the 1940s, but is a phenomenon that exists, up until this day. Not an example of a strike action, but a more recent example is the Evergreen, ship that got caught in the Suez Canal a number of years ago that led to the suspension of international trade for a small period. And so I think capitalism tries to make people feel like, atomized individuals, but actually the solidarity of the seamen in Western Australia shows the collective nature of our work and of the working class. But I think it also shows the capacity for solidarity across racial lines in a really, really important way. And so again, capitalism puts forward a politics of racism, a politics of divide and rule. It's no doubt that there was huge amounts of racism amongst, white working class people in Australia in the 40s, as there is today. But when people are more politicised, when a demand for solidarity is put out, and when people heed that call, those racial divisions can be thrown up. The black ban in the case of the Pilbara strike was also repeated in the case of the Wurundjeri strike that happens a couple decades later. But then also there's echoes of it in the pink ban when BLF construction workers went on strike to demand that a gay student at Macquarie University not be expelled, or the green bans where whole parts of the Melbourne and Sydney CBD were stopped from destruction by striking construction workers. So not only does it show you the collective nature of labour, the capacity for solidarity and common struggle, but also the way that the working class, when they create methods of resistance, those memories can echo down and can strengthen the resistance of workers decades later.
Absolutely. And that sort of collective nature and collective fight back is so important because there's all these sort of oppressive divisions that are drawn up in society based on race, gender, so forth. And when workers move as one together against the bosses, the main line is drawn that the bosses are clearly the ones who are oppressing everyone, exploiting everyone, fucking everyone else over. And they're the target. Their system's the target in terms of who we need to fight back against. And that's a very important lesson. And yeah, it's true. Back in the time in the 1940s, Australia was still is a deeply racist country today. But back then, it's incredible racism, stolen generations period, big protection boards all across the country are trying to control and demonise Aboriginal life everywhere. And to have a sort of a jag in that with this strike is an important lesson of actually ordinary people do not benefit from this sort of oppression and exploitation. It's only the capitalists, it's their state, it's their system that benefit from this because they're the ones who want to dominate and rule over people. And I think that's so important in today's time where we are seeing incredible racism right across the world, whether it's against Aboriginal people, but also Palestinians, people in the Middle East as well, from Iran to Lebanon. This is the kind of power we can utilise to draw that link and say, we'll fight for your liberation.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the people who led this strike, some of the people who made it happen. Can you tell us a bit about some of these individuals?
Yeah, so I wanted to mention a few. I mean, like, I could keep going on forever talking about the many individuals of the strike. And the reason why is because also the memory of the strike, which I'll talk a bit about later, still is maintained right to this day. Like, people who are descendants from the strike, who are living right now in the Pilbara region, in the mining cooperatives that was set up during the strike and after, still remember this strike and hold it dear to their hearts. So that's something worth noting. But some of the main figures I mentioned already, Clancy McKenna and Dooley Binbin, these were incredible lawmen who helped to set up the strike and give it leadership and confident militant leadership of fighting back against the authorities. I mentioned before, they, went around, got their steps up all across the Pilbara and just talked non-stop, station by station, going through every kind of grievance and underconfident feelings the workers have on these stations, to be like, we understand where you're at, racism's intense, but we can actually push back and win. That's really important, and we should do this, basically trying to convince people that we should go on strike.
And this was not without personal risk to themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Like, Dooley Binbin and Clancy spent so long in prison over the course of this strike, because every time they went to make an argument, when they went to get solidarity, when they tried to bring more people into the strike,
that's right.
The police were there chucking them into jail for their efforts to make this strike happen. And it was...
The police repression is a big aspect of this strike, because the state and the police were ready, right on the attack against strikers, and it was incredibly dehumanising what they did. Like, some of the more infamous photos of Aboriginal slavery back in colonisation, of Aboriginal people in chains around their necks. That's what the cops did to these strikers. They basically went out to these strikers and said, put this chain on, and they'll basically say, we got to talk to your boss of your strike. And all the Aboriginal workers did two things. They said, fuck right off, we're not doing this. And two, we don't have a boss. We're all workers here. We're all on the same strike. What are you talking about? There's no such thing as a boss for us in this strike, which is incredible bravery. But then the policemen in the state would just basically say, okay, if you don't put this chain on, we'll shoot you. So intense repression coming from the state police, basically. So Clancy and Dooley were basically chained and then imprisoned. But this wasn't like a moment where strikers saw their lawmen and were like, oh God, if that's happening to them, maybe we should stop. Like, this is really... Because that's the intended effect, right, of the cops in the state, to be like, show some intimidation, scare the strikers, they won't go on strike anymore, and we can return back to normalcy. That did not happen. There was lots of instances of Aboriginal strikers actually marching to the cop station, demanding that Clancy and Dooley Binbin and Don McLeod, who also got arrested at many times, be freed. And anytime that happened, they got free, because and that points to the confidence and the working class power these people had, that they won't be intimidated by the state police, and that even if they had their lawmen arrested, they're going to go up to that cop station and demand that they be released. And so it's incredible, not only identification of these, incredible men, but also ability of workers to say, we're going to stand up for each other, and you're not going to break us down. So
yeah, absolutely,
really amazing.
Well, another figure who comes up a lot in the retelling of the Pilbara strike is Daisy Bindi. We talked about at the beginning that women were quite integral to this strike, and Daisy was one of the sort of leading women workers who helped make this strike happen. Yeah,
and I think this story, I really wanted to include this in this podcast, because I remember reading this article by Sandra about the Pilbara strike, and she made a really good point. Sandra Bloodworth, sorry, check out her article. It's bloody brilliant. It was, I think, a celebration of the strike on May Day, I think a couple of years ago. But one point she made, which I thought was important, is that, this strike can be talked about as it's just the men, going off, and, they're the really courageous guys. They're getting arrested. Look at Don McLeod. He's getting arrested all the time, and he's going to fight the authorities. But women in this strike took an incredible political lead, which I think is so important, because especially when it comes to sexism under capitalism, there's this really demonising thing against women, being like, you have to be passive people, be child rearers, that's your role in society. Just that's just who you are under capitalism. Where in this strike here, but also strikes generally, actually the story of most strikes is like women actually taking a political lead and actually taking a fight back against the bosses, which I think is so important. Daisy Bindi basically tells that kind of story in the Pilbara strike, and so she organised meetings in 1945 to call out support for this strike. And police constantly threatened her whenever she tried to involve in a strike, and she'll just look at the cops and be like, no chance. Like, you're telling me to get away from the strike. I'm in the middle of this and you're not telling me otherwise, all right? Like, really just like such a confident person in saying, no, I'm part of this and I will, I won't be intimidated, basically. She actually not only was a sort of key part of the strike in gathering more people's support and getting more women to be part of the strike in a leading role, but also afterwards, she just remained a sort of political leader in the mining cooperatives that was set up during the strike and continued onwards after, to also link up with other workers and Aboriginal people right across the Pilbara region to give them a sense of self-determination and authority over their lives. And she did that as being part of the working class, which I think is so, so important. It's working class power that gives you that. And so for her to kind of teach that lesson and link up with other Aboriginal workers, an incredible figure that should never be forgotten during this episode, I think.
Well, you mentioned the mining cooperatives there. So one of the dynamics of the Pilbara strike was that when the workers went on strike, they actually went elsewhere and set up these cooperatives, these communities that for a period were sort of democratically run, where people had the capacity to decide, what they did. They would sell the products that they what they mined in order to fund these cooperatives. So tell us a little bit about these cooperatives, what was the significance of them, what they looked like, how they worked?
So they were set up basically as strike camps to support the strikers. So like a lot of the strike funding went to these sort of camps to help set up a base of support basically for the people who were on strike. So that's the kind of initial beginnings, because you kind of need that support base because, as we mentioned before, the state's after you, arresting you. A lot of big attacks on the strike were to happen in these numerous amounts of years. So that's where the base sort of started. But they also just became these incredible, as you said, incredible sort of organising spaces where life was also just organised in a much more democratic and collective nature. And what I mean by that is, these camps actually organised cooking and childcare in a collective sense. So it wasn't just left up to women. It was, it was incorporating everyone, men, women, children, also teenagers as well involved in these roles. Which helped to enable women to be involved in political life, that it wasn't just this gender divide of the men go do the strike, the women just do all the cooking and cleaning. No, it's actually much more of everyone is part of this, so that everyone can also be part of the strike as well, which I think is so fantastic. And part of that kind of collective organising, which enabled women to be part of the strike and for all these different areas to be run collectively, was collective meetings were organised in the camps where decisions got made. And in these meetings, the chair of the meetings would be very encouraging for young people to speak in, but also for women to speak up in and say, you're involved in this strike, you should share your opinions. And if you've got grievances about what's happening in the camps, please, raise them and we will definitely address them. Which is incredible. This sort of kind of basically meetings where anyone can raise what they want about, how the strike's going, what do we need to do to best support it, but also what can we do to best support Aboriginal people in this region as well, in another station. So it became this real hotbed of just countering the station camps, as we mentioned before, where you have pastoralists and bosses controlling and demonising Aboriginal life. compared to these mining cooperatives, Aboriginal people are running their lives, but not just like, oh, an Aboriginal boss gets to dictate to everyone.
Yeah.
It's everyone in it on together in a collective way.
And when the strike culminated in victory, when the wages of the workers were increased, when conditions were improved, it was the case that these mining cooperatives were actually more attractive options for Indigenous people, and many of them stayed in the mining camps, the mining cooperatives, because they had more control over their own lives, and it was sort of as well connected to this developing question of land rights, and people point to the Pilbara strike as one of the inception moments for the struggle for land rights for Indigenous people, which is pretty incredible. One thing that I read about when we were sort of preparing for this as well was that one of the things about the mining cooperatives was that it's pretty hard for people to be able to compete on a mineral market. And one of the things that happened was that there became a bit of a division that existed in the camps between the people who went to go negotiate the price of the commodities and the people who did the work. One person referred to them as the doers and the talkers.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that points to is that in a more like recent context, these questions can come up as like a cooperative's answer to the crisis of, capitalism, the horrible nature of it, the whatever. But when you're in a sea of capitalism, it's pretty hard to survive against that. And I think it points to the need that we actually have to totally overcome capitalism in order to be able to overcome the questions of oppression, of exploitation that exist under capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, these mine cooperatives, the way in which they're established is based on workers' power and democracy, and that's a really fantastic thing. But then if you don't solve that question of overthrowing capitalism, like you're still participating in capitalist society with the market and so all these different areas of industry. And so that will have an effect in terms of the way in which these things are run, which I think is an important qualifier to make in terms of what's the kind of strategy of like trying to overturn capitalism, trying to smash the system, rather than kind of working coexistence, I would say. So it's an important qualifier to make, I think, and it's right to make that, because it can seem like, okay, maybe we'll just make a co-op now, and then we just go and, okay, guys, that we're done. We can just run society anew, even though capitalism still exists, and maybe we still have to interact with them, with the system. I think that's not the right thing to do. I think the right thing to do is focus on the reason why these cooperatives did come about is because workers were taking power and actually fighting against capitalism. And what we want to look towards is how can that power can win, not just in places like Pilbara, but the whole country, the whole world. How it can inspire other struggles as well.
So the Pilbara strike is just, I think, such an incredible moment in Australian Indigenous and working class history. There's all of these beautiful moments. You've talked about the strike pamphlets that were developed, the calls to working class people across Western Australia around the country to provide support through funds, through their own strike action. There's demonstrations of young people, students in the cities. There's big town hall meetings. There's the strike leaders themselves going across across Western Australia, presenting to crowds of people, saying this is what we're doing and this is why you must support us. And I think there's just a few sort of key things coming out of it. I think the first thing to say is that working class struggle and the struggle against racism, these two things have to go hand in hand. What do you think about that?
I agree. No, I think it's absolutely right, because I think we have to understand that racism comes from capitalism. And if we were to take down racism in all its disgusting forms, we've got to take down the system of capitalism. And the way in which we do that is that working class fight back that can connect all the sort of different oppressed groups in this world and say, we can have a common fight against this system. And it's not only just this episode, the Pilbara strike, that tells us of that. There's so many other strikes in history of just this country. If we just look at Australia, the amount of strikes for Aboriginal rights, whether it was in the Pilbara region to Darwin from the late 40s to the early 50s, the Gurindji strike, which happens 20 years after, which takes a lot of inspiration from the Pilbara strike, puts this lesson into practice and is actually so crucial in winning as well. They won wages and conditions here. The Gurindji strike won partial land rights as well, and so forth. And so that's the key ingredient that we need in this fight back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another important lesson is that, you know, people who want to fight bosses, people who want to fight the ruling class, and people who want to stand against the, you know, capitalist state, they're well positioned to provide political and organisational support to the strike and to Indigenous people. Like, I sort of said it before, but I think the identification of who your enemy is and who your comrade is, this is a really important thing to be able to identify. And when you can do that, then you can go forward and say, well, I know what I need to do. I need to raise funds. I need to raise the word. I need to get practical solidarity to happen. And so, for the important criticisms and qualifiers about the Communist Party, I think the thing is that we need more socialists. We need more anti-capitalists to stand with Indigenous people in their struggles.
Absolutely. And when you have that kind of organisational support and solidarity, it's not just like it happens in the place where the strike's occurring, it happens in all across the country. So the Communist Party, for instance, you know, raised support and funds in different states that led to trade unions in other in other states and across the country to support the strike. So it's not just like a localised thing, it's all across the country, which is so important in giving it a significance, but also that support it needs in order to win, which is where the Siemens came in and provide the final blow to the pastoralists, basically.
And then my last sort of like thing to think about out of this strike is the way that today we hear it a lot. People are precarious, they're casualised, they're low income. This means that they're hard to organise. They have no traditions of working class struggle of going on strike, so how can people do it? All of these things. But I think that, you know, how can you get more precarious and hard to organise than Indigenous stockmen spread across the Pilbara under the thumb of the racist Western Australian government, like having to mark off the calendar night after night to link up their strike. I think that we can't let these sort of like theories of, you know, people are too hard to organise get in the way of the reality, which is when there's enough organisation, when there's will, when there's people willing to put in the work, big things can happen. Yeah,
from little things, big things grow, you know, that famous song Paul Kelly wrote. Yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, you as a worker, part of the working class, have the power to fight back. And like, you know, the Pilbara strike did not just happen out of nowhere. It was patient talking, organising and convincing of people, like what we talked about McKenna and Dooley Binbin, just going around to stations and talking with people, arguing and debating and saying that you can actually strike. And that sort of story is not too dissimilar to what we need to do today, where we have to go around to our workplaces and talk to people about, come along to the protests against the war in Iran. Come along to the protests against the genocide in Palestine. Okay, this is really fantastic. What's your grievances at work? What can we actually do to do something? How can we convince the other person? Okay, you're on board. Let's go convince, you know, you go convince 5 other people. I'll go convince other 5 people. Now we keep spreading. Like, we got similar tasks in a way in terms of trying to convince people of that need to come together and actually use our power as workers. So it's, I feel like the argument of the precarity of people, hyper-casualisation of workers today, obviously that is true. You know, there's a lot of awful realities people face today, but it doesn't mean you can't fight back. Yeah. Like, we absolutely can.
Yeah. Well, I think that we have a lot to owe the brave strikers of the Pilbara. They've got a lot of lessons for us today, and I think can help inspire, you know, a new generation of people to remember the traditions of May Day, to flex our industrial muscle and also prove that the struggle and solidarity across racial lines is eminently possible. And, you know, I hope we can see another years-long strike for land rights, for wages and conditions, and against the racism of the Australian state.
I sure hope so, because the fight's on and we desperately need to win against this horrible system. And the last thing I would want to mention is this beautiful documentary by Tiriki Onus on Bill Onus called Ablaze. Bill Onus was a famous agitator against anti-Aboriginal racism, was the key leader of the AAL, the Aborigines Advancement League. Mm-hmm. He did a play that commemorated the Pilbara strike called White Justice. That got shown to the Pilbara people in 2022. And, you know, if you want to, you know, have a good cry, I did last night, all the Pilbara people started dancing. I remembered, that's our strike.
Yeah.
And we need that more than ever, basically. So if that doesn't motivate you, I don't know what will. So,
riding out the party line.
Well, thanks so much for listening to The Party Line. Thanks, Oskar, for coming.
No, it was.
And I'm really glad that we got to do it in the heart of Footscray.
Yeah.
I think Footscray's in, Brunswick out.
Yeah, probably.
I can't believe you're not like, yeah, of course.
Yeah, look, I don't know. I remember Footscray back in 2010 and stuff.
Oh,
I've got all memories, and you know, I still hold to that. But
Okay.
that's just my thing, you know. It's not everyone.
Okay, all right. Well, if you want to support the podcast, you can like and subscribe. You can share the video, and you can become a supporter of the Patreon and give us a donation. So, yeah, peace out.
See ya.
Ciao.